Welcome back. Thanks for tuning in. Today's lecture is a summary lecture of the topic Stylistics. And this topic is prescribed in the syllabus for the students of semester 4 who are pursuing their MA in English at SKM University, Dumka. We have already discussed much of stylistics in the class, so this lecture is only going to summarize whatever we already know and perhaps try to clear some of your doubts. Now, when we think of literature, then we understand that it is something which is different from your ordinary piece of writing or perhaps your ordinary piece of communication, right? So that is why it is called literature. Now, if I have to say that I am hungry, then it is a very simple sentence. And if I have to say that the emptiness in my stomach is making my heart ache, right? So, or something similar in a very poetic way, then perhaps that sentence could be considered literary. Please excuse me for my poor example, but you get the idea, right? Now, what I am doing here when I am talking of hunger in these two lines is that in the second sentence, I am making language strange, right? I am using language in a way which is not generally done by people. I am using language not in a straightforward manner, not in a conventional day-to-day use, in a day-to-day use manner, but I am using language in a more creative way. And when I am using language in a more creative way, then the person who is listening to me talk about hunger in these elevated terms, then that person may think that there is something different which is happening with the language here. And this something different is precisely what defamiliarization is. That there is the familiar kind of language, the language that we are familiar with, the language that we know, and we usually converse in that language. And then there is a different kind of language which is reserved for literary practice. And it does not only happen in the field of literature where a different kind of language is used. And when I say language, I don't mean that from English to German and German to Italian in that manner. I just mean variation of the same language, right? So even when you look at court documents, right? Or if you look at official letters, so we do follow a very different kind of communication in these letters, right? We use language very differently. So when we use language very differently, the process of this difference is called defamiliarization. And one of the ways through which defamiliarization is achieved is called foregrounding. What is foregrounding? Now understand this from the example of this very innocent act of taking a photograph. Now say for example, I want to take a photograph of this glass, right? Now if I am taking a photograph of this glass and if my subject of the photo is this glass and the water in it, then I will perhaps focus more on this glass than on the wall behind me, right? And if the subject of the photo is not the glass but to show the wall behind, then this glass will be blurred and that wall will be highlighted, right? So this is how we do foregrounding, that we foreground certain important elements that we consider are important in either a photograph and similarly in a piece of text. Now when we read any poem and when we come across things like alliteration, or when we come across devices like repetition or onomatopoeia, then we see that all of these devices are also stylistic devices. And we see that all of these devices, they achieve this foregrounding. They try to foreground certain elements in the poem so that the reader's attention is immediately drawn towards these elements, right? So this is how foregrounding is achieved. Now, besides the literary devices that we already know about, let's talk about two major branches of foregrounding. The first is called deviation and the second is called parallelism. So let's first talk about deviation. Now, as the word suggests, deviation means deviating from something, and you can tie it up very neatly with the earlier concept of defamiliarization, that I am also making language strange, I am also making language unfamiliar, right, to the conditioned ears of readers or listeners who are used to or who are habituated to hearing writing in your day-to-day regular language, right? Now, when I say deviation, then of course I am deviating from that norm, right? Now, deviation is of two kinds. The first is external deviation, and the second is internal deviation. Now, any piece of writing, whether it is poetry, whether it is a piece of short fiction or a novel, right? Any piece of writing, we observe that deviations are always there. Now, say for example, one of the ways in which in a crime fiction the writer manages to hold our attention is by not telling us that who the murderer is, right? Or by not telling us about the twists. And by doing so, the writer gives us a chain of events, and we are led to believe in that chain of events, only to find out later that there is a major twist in the end, right? And that twist is appealing to us because that twist comes as a deviation from what we were trying to think or what we were trying to believe that the end might turn into. And we are surprised to find that, contrary to what we had thought that how the ending would be, we are surprised to find that the killer is actually someone else. So that is called your external deviation. Now, internal deviation is achieved within these forms of writing. Now, say for example, if there is a writer who practices a very distinctive style of writing, right? And in, say for example, in all of his novels, and if he is a writer of crime fiction, then if in all of his novels we see that the killer is revealed towards the end, and then he comes up with one more novel, and we see that the killer is revealed perhaps in the very first paragraph, right? So in the context of that particular writer's style, right? So when that writer is writing creatively, then he is deviating from the set norms of language. So there is external deviation happening there. And when he is deviating from the set norms of what he himself had established through his writings before, then that deviation is called internal deviation. Now let's come to the second part of foregrounding, which is called parallelism. Now, if there was something called deviation before, then parallelism is the opposite of that. If you are deviating from the ordinary use of language in order to create something literary, then if you are following suddenly the same patterns again and again in a creative work, then that will mean parallelism. Now, there are two kinds of parallelism. First is your syntactic parallelism, and the other is your semantic parallelism. Now, let's understand what syntax and semantics have to do with each other. Syntax is the way a sentence is constructed, right? So when you write a sentence in say for example past continuous tense, then you would probably come up with an example like he was going to the market, right? So there you have the noun he, was, auxiliary verb, going, V4, the fourth form of the verb go, to, which is your preposition, the, which is your article, and market, which is again noun, right? So if someone asks you that what is the syntax in this sentence, then you will tell that this sentence comprises of two nouns, one auxiliary verb, one fourth form of the verb, one article, one preposition arranged in a specific order, right? So that becomes the syntax of your sentence. Semantics is concerned with how meaning is operated across language, and what is the nature of meaning, how it changes. So while semantic is concerned with what the sentence or what the phrase or the word may mean, syntax is concerned with how those very things are constructed. So let's get on with first subpart of parallelism, which is your syntactic parallelism, which is syntactical parallelism, right? So just to give you an example of that, if I take one sentence, right, and if I say that the first sentence, I say that like water, grief soaked me wet, right? What is happening here is we see that there is the word like, water, comma, grief soaked me wet, right? So there is comparison happening at the very beginning of the sentence with the word like. Then there is the noun water, an element, then there is comma, grief is an emotion, soaked me wet, soak is in the past form, me is your pronoun, and wet is your adjective, right? And if I take another sentence and I say that like sun, happiness turned me dry, right? So here again I am following the same sentence structure. Like, then there is the noun, which is an element or relating to element, right? Element heat. Then you have like sun, happiness. Happiness again is an emotion. Turned me dry. Right? So turned is the past of turn, me again is the pronoun, and dry is your adjective. So what you're seeing here is that even though these two sentences mean different things, they are constructed in a similar manner. And such instances we observe quite a lot in poetry and even in prose sometimes. So say for example in the case of this very famous novel by Charles Dickens, The Tale of Two Cities, like it's a long sentence, but if we take just the first two clauses of the sentence, we'll see that it was the best of times, it was the worst of times, right? So again, these two clauses are constructed similarly. It was the best of times, so there is your it, there is your auxiliary verb, right, was, there is the best of time, and then it was the worst of time. Now let's come to the second subpart of parallelism, which is semantic parallelism, where the meaning is the same while your sentences may differ in their construction, right? So when I say that, say for example, I take one sentence and I say that it was a cold, dark day, right? So it is the first sentence, it was a cold, dark day. Usually the idea of a day being cold is connected with the lack of personal interaction, the lack of warmth, the lack of emotion, right? And dark day could mean whether in the most literal sense that the sun was very subdued, or dark could mean in a metaphorical way that it was a depressing day, right? And if I use another sentence and I said that the day began on an impersonal, sad note, right? And continued that way. So then we see that both these sentences pretty much mean the same, that the day was not at all happy, the day lacked any kind of interpersonal warmth, and the day did not give any opportunity for whoever the speaker is to feel happy inside, right? So in these two sentences we see that even though the meanings are similar, we see that their sentences are constructed in very different ways. Now, the reason parallelism is called parallelism is like if you consider parallel lines, two parallel lines, now they will not meet, so they are not the same, they may be similar, right? They are going on the similar path, but they are not replaceable, right? They are not mutually replaceable. They are two different things. So Similarly, in both these examples, even though the sentences are constructed in a similar way, in the case of syntactic parallelism, they will mean two different things. And even if there are two sentences which might mean and that are similar in their meanings to each other, even then they may be constructed in a different manner. Right? So these are the examples of syntactic and semantic parallelism. There is also one concept left, which is called derivation. And derivation is also something that writers do quite often. Derivation is the process through which you create new words, right? And sometimes, say for example, when we were little kids and we would be standing in the school assembly or we would be in the class, and if we would be making noise, then the teacher would come and say that do not exhibit this unparliamentary behavior, right? So when we look at the word unparliamentary, so the main word is parliament, and then of course you add the prefix un at the beginning of it. So then it becomes non-parliament-like, right? Or not gentle, or perhaps not well-behaved, right? So that is unparliamentary. But the thing is that unparliamentary is a word, right? So it still is codified within the regular usage of a language. Now, if I have to take example of the place where we are living in, Dumka, and let's say, for example, that if a person comes from New York and that person is habituated to a certain kind of lifestyle, and they come to Dumka and they start demanding that take me to a fancy restaurant which is open at around 12 in the night. And Dumka does not first have any fancy restaurants, and even if there are restaurants, then they are not open till 12 in the night. Then some of you might tell him that this is a very undumka behavior that you are exhibiting. Now, undumka is not a word, right? It is not yet a word which you can find in dictionary. And here you are creating this new word. Here you are creating this new word to explain or to just convey what you would have conveyed by perhaps using 10 or 12 words. And by just using this undumka behavior and by using this made-up word called undumka, you are able to condense whatever you are feeling and whatever you had to say into this one new word which you have creatively come up with. So this creativity also falls under the scope of literary style. We see many examples of writers creating new words and writers taking liberties with the way words are used, with the way words are constructed, in order to generate meaning that they intend to generate, and in order to be precise to what they have in mind, and in order to articulate precisely on the paper as well as in speech, right? So in this lecture we started with the concept of defamiliarization, which is the process of making language strange, making language unfamiliar to the listeners of the language, the readers of the language, right? And we also saw that this defamiliarization is achieved by this process of foregrounding, which is a very important process in terms of literary production, in terms of literary writing. So when we are writing any literary piece of work, then of course we are utilizing certain devices, certain figures of speech, which highlights what we are trying to say, which foregrounds the emotions that we are trying to articulate. This foregrounding has two subparts, or in other words, I could say that this effect of foregrounding could be achieved through two different ways. The first way is through deviation, and the second is through parallelism. Then we saw that in deviation there are two subparts, which is external and internal, and in parallelism you have two subparts, which are syntactic and semantic parallelism. And in the end, we saw this concept of derivation, that where we derive new words or we create new words from existing words in the dictionary. In doing so, we are able to articulate very precisely what we want to say in the absence of the nearest acceptable word, which we perhaps will not be able to find in a dictionary, or which perhaps does not exist within the accepted codes of language. So we are forced to make a new word. So this is derivation. This was all for today's lecture. I hope that this has cleared your doubts, and I hope that this has provided you with a nice basis for your revision of stylistics. Thank you for tuning in. I will see you later.